On this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly TV, we take a look at the launch of one of the most underappreciated game consoles of all time, the TurboGrafx-16. When I was in high school, we knew one kid who had a TurboGrafx-16, and even though he would defend it valiantly, we made fun of him mercilessly, even though none of us had actually played one. Unfortunately, we all drank the console war Kool-Aid, and as a result, anything not made by Sega or Nintendo sucked by default as far as we were concerned. The TurboGrafx and later the Turbo Duo would of course go on to die a slow and painful death here in the United States, but today we're looking at its birth, when the console was full of potential and its future seemed bright. Not a lot of information exists about the launch of the TurboGrafx, but based on what we do know, it appears that only 3 games were actually available during the test launch in New York and Los Angeles, with 6 additional games being released sometime around the national rollout. So now let's take a look at the history of the TurboGrafx-16, its launch, and the 9 games that launched with it in August and September of 1989. The history of the TurboGrafx-16 is really the tale of 2 companies, and to tell it we need to first travel back to 19th century Imperial Japan. In 1899, Kunihiko Itaware founded the Nippon Electric Company after spending time in the United States working with Thomas Edison. The company manufactured and maintained telephones and telephone switches, and in the 1920s branched out into radio transmission equipment. During World War II, NEC's factories were placed under military control, and several were partially or totally destroyed by Allied bombing. At the conclusion of the war, things quickly returned to normal, with NEC's main factories reopened by early 1946. In 1958, NEC developed their first vacuum tube-based computers, including this NEAC 1101, and the following year released their first transistor-based computer, the NEAC 2201, which I thought would be smaller. NEC continued developing computer systems for worldwide telephone, radio, and satellite communications use for the next 2 decades. In 1973, brothers Yuji and Hiroshi Kudo opened a store in their hometown of Sapporo, Japan. The brothers grew up next to a rail line and named their shop after the Hudson locomotive that steamed past their house every day. Initially just a shop selling the odd combination of Citizens Band radios and artistic photographs, the brothers began selling personal computer supplies in 1975. In 1978, they began developing and selling computer games, and in 1984 became Nintendo's very first third-party developer. Their first release on the Famicom, Lode Runner, was a million seller, and they followed that up the next year with the iconic Bomberman. Legend has it that with the money they made from these early Famicom games, the brothers bought and restored the very Hudson 464 locomotive that used to steam past their childhood home. In the 1980s, NEC began manufacturing consumer electronics, including PCs and audio-video equipment, and in 1987 the 2 companies' paths finally crossed. Hudson had tried unsuccessfully to develop custom hardware for Nintendo, while NEC was keen to break into the home video game market. The 2 companies jointly developed a video game console that would come to be known as the PC Engine. The system was based around an 8-bit bank-switchable CPU and a 16-bit graphics processor, both developed by Hudson. The PC Engine had a palette of 512 colors, of which up to 482 could be simultaneously displayed on the screen, helping give the system's graphics their signature look. Games were distributed on credit card-sized cartridges called Hue cards, very similar in form factor to the My cards for the Sega Master System, and were an evolution of the B cards that Hudson had developed to distribute MSX software. The system was released on October 30th, 1987, and the following year outsold the Famicom in Japan. The North American iteration of the console, the TurboGrafx-16, was priced at $199 and was released on August 29, 1989 in New York and Los Angeles, with a national rollout following shortly afterward. Games which sold for $49.99 were now referred to as turbo chips instead of hue cards, and available peripherals included the $30 Turbo Booster, which added composite video and stereo outputs, and the $18 Turbo Tap, which gave the system 5 controller ports instead of the stock 1. In comparison, the Sega Genesis, which was launched just 2 weeks prior, was priced at $189, had 2 controller ports, a stereo headphone jack, and needed only a $10 cable via mail order for composite video output. In the early days of the 16-bit era, the choice between the TurboGrafx and Genesis was far from clear. NEC had name recognition with computer users, and the system's massive success in Japan, where it was Sega who was a distant third, helped create hype in the United States. Additionally, Sega's first American attempt at a home console was largely ignored, giving them no momentum in the home video game market. For various reasons, the discussion of which being outside the scope of this episode, the TurboGrafx-16 was never really able to gain a significant market share here, although it would go on to become the first home console to support CD-ROM media, and had a small but steady stream of quality releases on both TurboChip and CD until the platform's discontinuation in late 1994. But for early adopters of the TurboGrafx-16, there was no shortage of great games to play in the late summer of 1989.
Introducing TurboGrafx-16, the next generation video game system. It's 4 times faster, so the games are more exciting. There are almost 10 times as many colors, so the arcade quality graphics are even more intense. And you can expand your system with a CD player for CD games with sound effects that are turbocharged. TurboGrafx-16 from NEC, the higher energy video game system.
Keith Courage and Alpha Zones was the pack-in game for the TurboGrafx-16. The game was released in Japan as Spirit Hero Wataru and was based on an anime TV series of the same name, but the plot was completely changed during localization and is now amazingly stupid. The game was not developed by Hudson, but rather by Advance Communication, whose only other US released TurboGrafx game was 1990's Tiger Road. Keith Courage is a combination cutesy Japanese platformer and action platformer, with each stage split into 2 separate sections. In the first part, you slowly walk along, killing enemies, collecting gold, and entering shops to buy needed supplies. This includes magic items and weapons dealers, as well as Nurse Nancy, who you can pay to restore your health. Gameplay in these levels is primarily characterized by you farming for cash by walking back and forth killing the endlessly respawning enemies. Speaking of which, I thought the Maneki Neko was a Japanese good luck charm, so why are you killing them? Anyway, you reach the end of the overworld section and you're whisked away by a magic rainbow to an underworld where you're suddenly wearing a mechanical Nova suit and wielding a much larger sword. It's here that the biggest problem with Keith Courage becomes apparent. There's simply too much contrast between the 2 halves of the game. The underworld stages are better looking, have better music and sound effects, faster gameplay, and have much more interesting enemies like Mr. Guy with a Gun for His Head here. After beating the end stage boss in an underworld level, the game feels really bad when it plunks you back down in an overworld. This game probably wouldn't be bad at all if it consisted only of the underworld portions of the game, more fleshed out and with better level design. The game also only gives you 1 life, but its unlimited continues give you very little reason not to just plow through the game in the first sitting. Keith Courage isn't horrible, but it's a very average game that was probably only localized here so that NEC would have a platformer to include with the system, since they saw Nintendo as their primary rival here in the US. The TurboGrafx was already slightly more expensive than the Genesis, and may or may not have required the purchase of extra peripherals depending on your needs. The inclusion of Keith Courage as the pack-in game almost guaranteed that the majority of gamers were going to feel the need to immediately pick up an additional game as well, as this is simply not a game that makes you fall in love with your brand new console. The legendary Axe was developed by Victor Interactive Software, a company better known for the KO Flying Squadron series. In this side-scrolling action platformer, you take control of Gauguin, an axe-wielding barbarian who is predictably trying to save his kidnapped girlfriend. While there's nothing particularly original about the gameplay, the legendary axe pulls it off flawlessly, with precise responsive controls and an interesting variety of unique stages and enemies. The graphics are detailed and extremely colorful, as one would expect from a quality TurboGrafx title. The real highlight of the game in my opinion though is the soundtrack, as each track seems to perfectly fit the level in which it's featured, which contributes heavily to the game's ambiance. Of all the games available at launch, the legendary axe best shows off what the TurboGrafx was capable of, and the first time you reached the level 1 arachnid mini-boss, you knew that you weren't playing Nintendo anymore. Throughout the game you can pick up power-ups to restore health, raise strength, and increase your attacking speed. The game is tough enough that the average gamer is going to have to work at it for a while before beating the game, but fun enough that they'd look forward to the challenge. At the risk of beating a dead horse, the fact that this wasn't the pack-in game for the TurboGrafx-16 speaks volumes about how little some Japanese game companies understood the American market back then. Altered Beast was a good game in its day, certainly much better than people give it credit for today, but it was no killer app. The legendary axe was named the 1989 Game of the Year across all platforms by Video Games and Computer Entertainment, and the 1989 TurboGrafx-16 Game of the Year by Electronic Gaming Monthly. Especially when you have no reputation in the market, there's something to be said for driving system sales by giving away your best game for free. The only one of the 3 first-wave launch games developed by Hudson Soft, Victory Run is a racing game based on the Paris-Dakar Rally. While the game's rally theme is well represented on the Japanese cover art, in the US we inexplicably got this cover, showing a streetcar racing into Paris. The object of the game is to complete the multi-stage race between Paris and Dakar, Senegal, which is in West Africa for you non-geography buffs. Before starting the initial stage, you choose which parts to take with you on your journey, as you will be needing to effect repairs along the way. For the most part, I like the aspect of realism that this imparts on the game, but when your shifter breaks and you can no longer use 4th gear, you might as well just restart the game because you'll be going way too slow to finish the stage in the allotted time. Speaking of the shifter, this game has no automatic transmission option, so you racing wimps will have to either suck it up or look elsewhere. There are 2 timers in the upper right hand corner of the screen. The top clock is your cumulative reserve time, and the bottom is your stage time. Any unused stage time at the end of each leg is added onto your reserve time, which you can then dip into whenever you run out of stage time. Probably the biggest challenge in this game is memorizing where all the undulations are in the road. They always seem to be strategically placed on curves so that they throw you completely off the track if you don't slow down beforehand. Also, much like Outrun, all the other cars on the road are extremely crash happy and have no problem cutting you off in traffic. And what's with all these big rig trucks, especially in the off-road sections? Where the hell are they headed? The graphics are, as expected, quite colorful, and I really like the music a lot. That being said, I couldn't really see myself buying this game back in the day, but most certainly would have rented it for a weekend. Moving on to the second wave of launch titles, Alien Crush was developed by Naxat Soft, a developer who, among a myriad of other titles, developed Air Zonk on the TurboGrafx, as well as Summer Carnival 92 Rekka on the Famicom. Alien Crush is a fantasy pinball game with an alien theme, very reminiscent of the Alien movies. At startup, the game lets you pick one of 2 tracks to listen to while playing. The first, Lunar Eclipse, seems heavily influenced by the Deep Purple song Burn, while Demon's Undulate bears a striking resemblance to the main theme from Jaws. The table is 2 screens tall and flips between the upper and lower screen rather than scrolling. Although this might seem less, graphically advanced than pinball games that do scroll, I actually like it better because it means that your flippers are always in view. The ball physics feel a little bit floaty but are passable, and you can choose between fast and slow modes when you start the game. The advantage of a pinball video game, aside from the fact that it can simulate pinball on your TV, is that it's free from the constraints of reality, allowing for games like Alien Crush, which actually created a living, breathing table. The graphics are superb, and with a ton of animation happening all over the table, this looks and feels nothing like playing a static pinball simulator. Aside from the main table, there's also a small bonus area that always looks the same, but has different enemies and objectives depending on conditions met on the main table. This is also the only time during gameplay that you hear a different musical track. Alien Crush was actually just the first in a long franchise of pinball games. It was followed up by Devil's Crush on the TurboGrafx in 1990, which was ported over to and slightly tweaked for the Sega Genesis under the name Dragon's Fury, which itself was followed up by Dragon's Revenge. There was also a Japan-only sequel to Alien Crush called Jackie Crush on the Super Famicom, and finally there was a modern remake/sequel of the original on the Wii called Alien Crush Returns. Much like Legendary Axe, this game is an absolute must-buy on the TurboGrafx. If not back then definitely now. China Warrior is the second game on our list developed by Hudson and was originally released for the PC Engine all the way back in 1987. The game has become famous for being crappy and is held up as an example by ignoramuses of why the TurboGrafx was a failed console. The problem is it's actually kind of a fun game. A side-scrolling beat-em-up game reminiscent of Kung Fu on the NES or Black Belt on the Sega Master System, the game has equally shallow and repetitive gameplay, and just like those games, still manages to be entertaining in small doses. The most noteworthy characteristic of the game might be its humongous sprites, which allowed the developers to put an insane amount of visual detail into the characters. The main character, Wang, who is an obvious Bruce Lee ripoff, actually gets a bloody face and torso as he takes more damage in the game. Take too much damage and die, and you get sent all the way back to the beginning of the stage, even if you died during a boss battle. Speaking of which, this end-level boss, who is somehow the boss of the first 3 levels, looks like a cross between Jesse the Body Ventura and the Iron Sheik. Most of the enemies in this game look like monks, but you also have to deal with smaller foes like butterflies and poison frogs, and who the hell is throwing these rocks? While China Warrior was never going to win any awards for Game of the Year back in the day, much like Altered Beast, it also isn't the garbage that some people try to claim it is. While I certainly never would have bought this game at full price back in the day, it would have been totally worth a weekend rental or bargain bin purchase. Power Golf was developed by Hudson and was the only sports title available at launch, although world-class baseball would follow in the coming months. It's a decent game, but feels a lot more like its 8-bit predecessors on the NES than it does like its peers on the Genesis. The graphics, though, are obviously much more colorful, the music is quite catchy, and I guess fits whatever would go along with a golf game, which is good because you can't shut it off. Power Golf allows up to 3 people to play simultaneously, and you can even all share the same controller. There are 3 characters to choose from, and they all play differently. The older guy has the most power but less control, the girl is the opposite, and the younger guy is somewhere in between the two. Speaking of the characters, as pointed out by the video game critic in his review, the younger guy bears a striking resemblance to Michael O'Keefe's character in Caddyshack. As was common with early golf games, Power Golf does not tell you the maximum possible distance of each club, so you'll have to just look them up in the manual until you memorize them. One of the biggest problems I had with this game is that although it varies depending on which character you choose, the power meter moves really fast, while the trajectory of your shot is very sensitive to even slight inaccuracies in your swing or a gentle breeze. The little directional pointer that you use to aim your shot is also pretty sucky, but neither problem is a deal breaker, it just takes extra practice to overcome. Power Golf is a decent but not great golf game, and was easily eclipsed by the PGA Tour Golf Series on the Genesis. As was the case with China Warrior, this would have been a fine weekend rental or bargain bin pickup, but would not have been worth full price unless you were an absolute video golf junkie. Vigilante was developed by Irem, who also developed one of my favorite childhood arcade games, Moon Patrol, in 1982, and is perhaps most famous for R-Type. Vigilante is a 1988 arcade game that was subsequently ported to the TurboGrafx-16 along with a myriad of other platforms, and was interestingly the only arcade port out of the 9 launch games. In this side-scrolling beat-em-up, you once again have to save your kidnapped girlfriend. Although this damsel in distress is called Madonna, this is simply the protagonist's girlfriend's name and is not the famous entertainer. Unless this game takes place in an alternate universe in which the famous entertainer is the main character's girlfriend. This is of course one of 2 side-scrolling beat-em-ups released at launch, the other being China Warrior, which we already talked about. And while Vigilante might seem like the better game initially, I'd have to give the nod to China Warrior, although neither are exactly A-list titles. While the fighting is generally hand-to-hand or foot-to-face, you can occasionally pick up weapons like this set of nunchucks, which makes the game a lot easier. As is generally the case with these games, you fight a never-ending horde of enemies on your way to the boss at the end of each level. Speaking of the bosses, they all have regenerating health, which I can't say I've ever seen in a game like this. Whose bright idea was that? So, final word on Vigilante? It's alright, I guess. It's fun to play through literally once or twice, which I guess would have made it fine to rent back in the day, but your money can certainly be better spent elsewhere. Co-developed by Hudson and celebrated shooter developer Compile, Blazing Lazers was the lone shooter available at the launch of a system famous for them, although R-Type and Fantasy Zone weren't far off. This vertical shooter is an example of the kind of game that has given the Turbo a cult following, and is definitely a game that I would have been willing to buy at full price at launch. Called Gunhead in Japan, the game is actually based on a mecha movie of the same name, in which a gang of galactic mineral scavengers are looking for a rare element called Tex-Mexium. In Blazing Lazers, you have 4 main weapons to choose from, and although it's easy to develop an affinity for one over the others, experience will teach you that different weapons work better in different areas of the game. You also have your choice of secondary power-ups, including a set of multi-bodies, homing missiles, or defensive shields. The graphics do an excellent job of showing off the Turbo's visual capabilities, and there's a tremendous amount of variety between stages. The game is also very fast-paced but has hardly a hint of slowdown. The soundtrack is nothing less than outstanding, which I've come to expect from the PC Engine and TurboGrafx libraries. Blazing Lazers also features digitized speech, but the deadpan delivery reminds me of the ho-hum announcer from Baseball Stars on the Neo Geo. The difficulty curve in this game is such that the first few levels are pretty easy before things start to toughen up sometime around the halfway point. Thankfully, the game is very generous with extra lives, meaning that you should have a decent stockpile to draw from by the time you start needing them. When you die in this game, you don't respawn on the spot, but rather get sent back to a checkpoint. This might ostensibly seem like a bum deal, but if you get killed by a boss, it's nice to have a chance to power your ship back up before facing that boss again. Blazing Lazers is an outstanding game, not only one of the best titles available at launch, but one of the very best releases on the platform. Developed by prolific game developer and publisher Atlas, Dungeon Explorer is the 9th and final game on our list. While I generally save the best game for last, in this case it's a real toss-up between this game and Blazing Lazers. Dungeon Explorer is an action-adventure game with minor RPG elements. People who like to repeat things that they hear other people say describe it as a Gauntlet ripoff, but that's an ignorant oversimplification. Dungeon Explorer does borrow a couple of its core gameplay elements from that arcade classic, but the similarities end there. With the use of the Turbo Tap, it was possible for up to 5 players to play this game simultaneously, which is awesome. While Dungeon Explorer is certainly a great game to play single player, it really is a ton of fun to play with friends. The game also plays very differently depending on which character you choose and how many people are playing, giving this game incredible depth and replay value. At the beginning of the game, each player chooses from one of 8 different character classes, including Fighter, Thief, and Warlock. Each character class has its own strengths and weaknesses. Each uses a different melee weapon, and what black and white magic potions actually do depends on your character class as well. Dungeon Explorer's plot centers around the retrieval of the Aura Stone, which the King of Odessia needs to defeat the army of aliens that have invaded his land. This involves you fighting through a number of dungeons in order to finally reach the stone's hiding place. There's actually more than that going on, but I'll save that for you to discover. Each time you defeat the boss at the end of a dungeon, you pick up a crystal which levels up your character, increasing his or her maximum hit points, and raising one of your 4 stats, depending on what color the crystal is when you grab it. There are also power-ups placed in each dungeon and randomly dropped by enemies, but unlike the crystals, these are not permanent upgrades and are lost when you die. That being said, every time you restart the game, all of those temporary power-ups reappear in the dungeons, so you do have the option of going back through and recollecting them without having to deal with boss battles again. Other power-ups include a ring that raises your maximum hit points, potions that restore your health, and the aforementioned black and white magic potions. If you need to restore your health, you can always revisit the pub at the beginning of the game. You can also revisit the king after every boss battle to get some information and free potions, but it's hardly worth the effort unless you're already in the area. Dungeon Explorer uses a password system to allow you to continue where you left off, which comes in handy because the game can be a bit much to tackle in a single sitting unless you have an affinity for longer gameplay sessions. There are 2 bonus playable characters in the game, including the princess who gives you a code to unlock her once you rescue her in the first third of the game, and a hermit who can only be unlocked when playing as the bard, and who I never got to see at all, but who can also be unlocked using a password. Dungeon Explorer is a very tough game, especially when played solo. While the learning curve can be steep, it's also incredibly rewarding, and while at one point I felt like I was never going to get the hang of things, I eventually settled into a groove and spent more time playing this game than any other in preparation for this episode. At launch, if you were previously a fan of games like The Legend of Zelda, this game was right up your alley, and I think that a much closer comparison can be made between this game and games like Zelda or Crystallis than to Gauntlet. Both Dungeon Explorer and Blazing Lazers are regularly found on top 10 lists of TurboGrafx games, and would have easily been the 2 games that I would have purchased at the launch of the system. That's going to do it for this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly TV. This episode was the result of multiple viewer requests, so if there are any subjects you'd like to see covered on the show, please let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.